On Christmas Eve in 1945, the Sodder family's home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, stood as a symbol of warmth and togetherness. The house was alive with laughter, music, and the sparkle of holiday spirit. George and Jenny Sodder, proud parents of 9 children, had worked hard to provide their family with comfort and joy. That night, the glow of the Christmas tree lights reflected in the eyes of their children as they played with new toys, their excitement echoing through the rooms. It was a moment of happiness, one that seemed like it would be etched forever in their memories. Yet in a matter of hours, it would all turn into a nightmare no one could have imagined. As midnight crept closer, the younger children begged to stay awake. Jenny, reluctant but gentle, allowed them the treat of playing a little longer. George, tired from the day's work, retreated to bed, while the older children slipped away to their rooms. The house eventually grew quiet, and the family slept beneath a roof that had always felt safe. Outside, the winter air was still and heavy, the stars shining over the darkened hills of West Virginia. It seemed like nothing could disturb the peaceful holiday night. Then, in the silence of early morning, the world changed in an instant. Flames erupted within the Sodder home, spreading with shocking speed. The crackling fire tore through wood and walls, fueled by something no one could see. Within moments, smoke filled the air, and the peaceful Christmas night was shattered by chaos. Jenny awoke to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of fire creeping into the hallways. She shouted for her family, her voice desperate as she rushed to wake her children. The youngest cried in confusion, terrified as the heat pressed closer. George acted without hesitation. He pulled some of his children to safety, guiding them through the choking smoke and out into the cold night air. Outside, the snow reflected the burning house in terrible contrast, the once cozy home now an inferno. 4 of their children escaped with them, coughing and trembling, their faces lit by the red glow. But 5 others, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty, remained inside, trapped behind walls now swallowed by fire. George's instincts drove him back toward the house. He knew he had to save them, no matter what it cost. He ran to grab the ladder that always leaned against the side of the home, but it was gone, as if it had vanished into the night. Desperate, he turned to his trucks, intending to drive them against the walls and climb through the windows, but neither vehicle would start. It was as though fate had conspired against him, each attempt ending in frustration. The neighbors gathered, helpless as they watched the flames devour everything. The fire department was called, but they did not arrive until the house had been reduced to smoking ruins. By then it was too late. The Sodder home lay in ashes, and the 5 children who had not escaped were nowhere to be found. The Christmas that had begun with joy and laughter ended in horror, leaving behind grief, confusion, and a mystery that would never be forgotten. When the fire finally burned itself out, all that remained of the Sodder home was a heap of blackened rubble, twisted metal, and the lingering scent of smoke. As dawn broke over the small town of Fayetteville, the devastation stood in stark contrast to the joyful night that had come before. Neighbors whispered in shock, unable to comprehend how a family could suffer such a tragedy on Christmas Eve. But among the grief and sympathy, there was one detail that unsettled everyone: the absence of the children's remains. For 5 young lives to be swallowed by flames and leave nothing behind seemed impossible, and the unanswered question would spark years of speculation. Investigators arrived expecting to find evidence of the children's bodies beneath the ashes. In most house fires, bones, teeth, or at least fragments of remains can be recovered, even if the flames burn through the night. Yet after sifting through the debris, they found nothing. No trace of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., or Betty. Experts later noted that it would take far more intense heat, far longer than the Sodder fire had burned, to completely destroy human bones. This contradiction gnawed at George and Jenny, convincing them that something far stranger had happened. The official explanation offered little comfort. Authorities quickly declared the fire accidental, suggesting faulty wiring had caused the blaze. But this conclusion did not sit right with the family. The Sodder home had recently undergone electrical work, and the wiring had been deemed safe. On top of that, strange occurrences began to surface, each pointing toward a far more sinister possibility. Jenny recalled that in the days before the fire, the children had spoken of a man watching them from the road. George remembered an unusual stranger who had visited their property under the pretense of looking for work. studying the layout of the house in a way that seemed unsettling. More disturbing still, evidence showed that the Sodder family's phone line had been cut, not destroyed by flames, but deliberately severed before the fire spread. The idea that someone had planned the disaster crept into the couple's minds, leaving them restless and suspicious. Adding to the mystery was the discovery that George's ladder, normally propped against the side of the house, had disappeared. Later, it was found discarded in a ditch far from the property. The family's coal trucks, which George hoped to use as makeshift ladders to rescue the children, had both failed to start despite working perfectly the day before. These bizarre setbacks seemed almost orchestrated, as though someone had ensured that George would not be able to save his children that night. The delayed response from the fire department only fueled suspicions. Though the blaze had been reported quickly, it took hours for firefighters to arrive, by which time the house was already gone. Their search was half-hearted, their tools inadequate, and their conclusion final: the children had perished in the flames. Yet George and Jenny refused to believe it. Without evidence of remains, they could not accept that their children had been reduced to nothing. As the days turned into weeks, a chilling idea began to take hold. Perhaps the fire had not been an accident at all. Perhaps it had been a cover for something far darker. Perhaps their children had not died that night, but had been taken, spirited away under the cover of flames that erased every trace of truth. Before the fire, the Sodder family had already lived under a shadow of unease, though no one realized just how heavy it would become. George Sodder, the head of the household, was a strong-willed man who carried firm opinions and rarely kept them to himself. Among the immigrant community of Fayetteville, he was known for his sharp criticism of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government of Italy. While some in the town admired his boldness, others took offense. This tension simmered quietly until it began to manifest in chilling ways that George could not ignore. Months before the fire, George experienced encounters that, at the time, seemed strange but harmless. A man had come to the Sodder home under the pretense of offering insurance. He pressed George to purchase a policy, but when George refused, the man's demeanor shifted. He warned George that if he continued to speak against Mussolini, disaster would strike and his house would go up in smoke. At the time, George brushed it off as an idle threat, but the words would later echo in his mind like a sinister prophecy. Other moments hinted at a gathering storm. A stranger appeared at the Sodder property one day, pretending to inquire about work. He wandered around the home, paying particular attention to the fuse boxes and wiring. George thought it odd but let it pass. Soon after, another unsettling detail emerged when one of the older children noticed a man parked by the roadside, staring intently at the house as though studying it. These instances were unsettling, but not enough to trigger alarm until the fire brought them into sharper focus. After the blaze, stories began to surface from beyond the Sodder property. A woman living nearby claimed she had seen the missing children peering out of a passing car as the fire raged behind them. She described the image vividly, young faces pressed against glass, their expressions fearful and confused. Another witness insisted that she had seen the children at a tourist stop in Charleston, several miles away, accompanied by adults who discouraged them from speaking. To some, these reports seemed like wild imagination. To George and Jenny, they were signs that their children had not died but had been taken. The more the couple considered these accounts, the more the threats from the past began to make sense. Was the fire a deliberate attack orchestrated by those who resented George's outspoken views? Could the disappearance of the children have been revenge? A punishment carried out in the most devastating way possible? The lack of remains, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, the cut phone line, all of it pointed toward a carefully planned operation rather than a tragic accident. For George and Jenny, the grief of losing their children was tangled with the torment of not knowing their fate. If the children had been stolen, were they alive somewhere, forced into new lives against their will? Or had they met a darker end far from home, hidden forever by those who orchestrated the fire? The questions offered no rest, only deeper shadows. Each clue, each rumor, and each memory of a warning fed their conviction that what happened on Christmas Eve was no accident. Instead, it was part of a deliberate and terrible design, one that left them haunted with the unbearable uncertainty of what became of their 5 missing children. Years slipped by, but for George and Jenny Sodder, Time did not dull the ache of unanswered questions. Instead, each passing year seemed to deepen the mystery, adding new layers of uncertainty and strange discoveries that kept the family's hope alive. The fire had taken their home and, officially, 5 of their children, but the absence of remains left the possibility that the children had survived. This belief fueled an obsession that would stretch across decades, shaping the lives of everyone connected to the Sodder family. One of their most determined acts was erecting a massive billboard along Route 16 near Fayetteville. It displayed photos of the 5 missing children and a desperate plea for information. Offering a reward, the sign became both a landmark and a haunting reminder of the family's tragedy. Travelers passing through could not ignore the faces of the children staring back at them, a silent cry for answers that would remain for decades. For George and Jenny, it was more than a billboard. It was a constant declaration that they would never give up. Leads trickled in from across the country, some promising, others cruel dead ends. A woman in St. Louis claimed to have overheard people talking about the fire and a plan to abduct the Sodder children. Another report surfaced from Florida, where a woman insisted she had seen the missing kids with unfamiliar adults. A hotel worker in Charleston recalled seeing 4 children accompanied by 2 men and 2 women on the very night of the fire, describing how the adults discouraged the children from speaking. Each account carried the possibility of truth, but none could be proven. One of the most chilling moments came in 1967 when Jenny received a letter in the mail. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back was a cryptic note. Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A90132 or 35. The handwriting was odd, almost taunting, and the message made little sense. But the face in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to their missing son Louis. His eyes, his features, his expression, all seemed to match the boy who had vanished more than 20 years earlier. For Jenny, the picture was both a lifeline and a torment. If it truly was Louis, it meant he had survived the fire. But the strange message raised questions she could not answer. The family hired private investigators to follow the lead. But in a twist almost as mysterious as the fire itself, the investigators vanished. They provided no reports, no updates, and were never heard from again. The sudden disappearance of those tasked with uncovering the truth only deepened the sense of conspiracy. To the Sodders, it was evidence that powerful forces might be working to keep the truth buried. Despite years of searching, no concrete answers ever surfaced. The family traveled across states, followed rumors, and examined countless false leads, but certainty always slipped away. Hope remained, however, and that hope was carved into the very landscape of Fayetteville by the billboard. For passers-by, it was a curiosity, but for the Sodders, it was a monument to their relentless fight against silence and indifference. Every letter, every phone call, and every photograph brought with it a flicker of hope that their children were still out there, living under new names or hidden by unknown hands. Yet each dead end left them with deeper questions, locked in a cycle of grief and determination that would never break. The years might have taken away their home and much of their peace, but they refused to let time take away the fight for their children. The decades that followed the fire were marked by a relentless search for truth, but the mystery of the Sodder children refused to yield any clear answers. George and Jenny lived each day with the haunting belief that 5 of their children had not died in the blaze but had been taken. This belief shaped their lives, and it shaped the story that would grow into one of America's most enduring unsolved cases. The fire destroyed their home, but it was the unanswered questions in the ashes that truly consumed them. George spent the remainder of his life chasing leads, no matter how faint. He traveled across the country, visiting towns and meeting strangers who claimed to have seen the missing children. Every rumor, every whisper became a path he felt compelled to follow. Some leads brought him to small communities where children resembling his own were said to be living. Others led him to nothing more than empty roads and false hope. Despite the repeated disappointments, he pressed forward, driven by the fear that giving up meant abandoning his children to whatever fate had befallen them. Jenny carried her grief in quieter ways, but no less intensely. After the fire, she chose to wear black for the rest of her life, a daily symbol of mourning that never faded. She kept the family's Christmas tree up year-round, unable to let go of the holiday that had turned into tragedy. She preserved the belief that her children might someday walk back into her life, older, but still hers. For her, the absence of remains was the most powerful proof that the children had been taken, and this conviction gave her the strength to hold on even as the years passed. The mystery grew beyond Fayetteville, capturing the imagination of strangers across the country. Newspapers ran stories, travelers stopped at the famous billboard, and armchair investigators debated theories. Some believed the children had been kidnapped in retaliation for George's political views. Others suspected organized crime, pointing to the suspicious circumstances surrounding the fire and the delayed response of the fire department. Still others clung to the official explanation, suggesting that the children had simply perished and that the family's hope was only denial in disguise. The case became a puzzle with no clear solution, and every theory seemed to carry holes that could not be filled. When George died in 1969, he went to his grave without knowing what became of his children. Jenny lived on until 1989, her faith unshaken that they had survived. The surviving Sodder children inherited not only the mystery, but also the determination to seek answers. They kept the story alive, sharing it with anyone who would listen, unwilling to let the case fade into obscurity, even now. The disappearance of the Sodder children remains one of history's most unsettling mysteries. No bodies were ever recovered, no proof of survival ever confirmed. The truth lies somewhere in the void between possibility and impossibility, between fire and shadow. The ashes of the Sodder home may be cold, but the questions they left behind still burn. Did the children die that night in the flames, or were they taken into a life of silence and secrecy? With every passing year, the answer drifts further out of reach, leaving behind only secrets in the ashes and a story that refuses to rest.